Hi everyone, welcome to another video. This one's on the Industrial Revolution. We've already talked about so much of this stuff already, and you should have been reading up on it, that this should be pretty quick, an overview of stuff you already know, and we move on from there, so all good. There's not that much on this one, like it's maybe 12 or 13 slides, so let's begin, and I'll go through this pretty quickly. So when we look at the growth of industrial production, and some of the stuff we went over, we need to see how everything has a chain reaction that improved on something else. And so while this wasn't just an overnight, oh, let's just go straight to factories, what happens is it starts out with a few developments that make things easier, and then another development that made something else easier, and sure enough, the application of multiple things all coalesce together into something that really blew up into something amazing, into this industrial revolution. So the first one that really happened with the Enclosure Acts in England is the improved agricultural productivity. With that productivity, these small farms that used to be, private farms and whatnot, those went away, and large landholding took over. And so these large landholding farms could outproduce and were much more efficient than those small farms. And so now you had a boom in growth of food, and now a large population that could be supported by this efficiency. And a lot of those people flocking to the cities looking for jobs. At the same time, you had this development of canals as some of those more efficient ways of transporting goods across long distances, and they became profitable. And so now you had efficient ways of moving things to cities through these canals. Now you have a large population of people willing to work with increased transportation access, and now new ways of getting energy through coal and getting other materials to use like metals that will improve pretty much anything you put it to in terms of lasting longer, being able to withstand more power and energy into them. Like a lot of those mills, machinery and whatnot required a lot of metal to make. And so from all of this, you have these people willing to take risks because of the money they've accumulated. You have these canals for quicker transportation, and you're getting more machines through different industries that are adding up and being applied to somewhere else. So all of these make England one of the place to really develop, especially too, the resources that they didn't have within their own borders, they could trade for as they had a global empire. And so they had all the things they need to bring about this change and the Industrial Revolution. So let's look at what happens after England discovers it. It spreads. And as you can see, it spreads from roughly the 1840s outward in terms of massive industrial production. The United States has a slower beginning to that in production. They start in the early 1820s and 30s, and they're getting there, but it's not really till after the Civil War that industry can really take off in the US. So the US and Europe is where it first starts, but it does spread internationally. And Russia and Japan, that have been slow to industrialize and slow to adopt or even look at European inventions and discoveries and developments, see what industrialization can do in terms of productivity and bringing about more production out of their own people for only the cost of burning coal. And Russia particularly has a large source of it. The Japanese do not, and have a different route towards industrialization because of that. Now, the thing to keep in mind still is that most of the world is still producing. You still have India and China particularly producing lots of goods, but they will be eclipsed by Europe by the mid-1800s. And so that's to put in perspective that as these things are going, it wasn't that they just weren't making anymore, but their share, their global percentage of what they're producing decreases over time and changes their status a bit too. In terms of technology, all kinds of new things were developed. First, it was called the fossil fuel revolution. So one of those would just be the increased energy available. You have to understand, before this time period, the only way to get energy is by calories. It was by eating food and muscles using that energy to do something, whether it be an animal's muscles or a human muscle. And it's relatively not that, well, compared to machinery, it's not that efficient. The reason why, it's generally a 1-to-1 or just shy of a 1-to-1 ratio from calories consumed to calorie output. And so you can't really maximize efficiency when it's whatever you put in, you get out of it. It is only through the burning of coal, dead animals and plant matter from a long time ago pressed together, that you can unlock a lot more energy out of all of this. Hence, Land Before Time. But the second industrial revolution is where we start seeing all these major changes to life, whether it be the sewing machine, the cotton gin, the telegraph, typewriter. All of these inventions were coming out because of this stuff. Now, I have a couple stories for you. One of them, when we talk about railroads, steamships, and the telegraph, made exploration and moving within the interior and communication interior regions much more possible, including trade and migration. There's a video particularly about Robert Fulton, where I'm gonna nerd out. So first off, here's a little bit about Robert Fulton and what he did, and his knowledge of Thomas Jefferson.
My name is Jacqueline Langholtz, and I'm the manager of school and group programs here at Monticello. We're going to start with the engraving of Robert Fulton in Jefferson's chamber. And this is a special piece to me that I was excited to talk about because I first noticed it 6 years ago. I was actually interviewing for the position. Robert Fulton is credited with adapting the steam engine for shipping, which of course has tremendous importance on New York as a port city, and a collection of what are really mainly islands, connected today, of course, by bridges and tunnels. But in the 1700s and 1800s, they were connected by ships and ferries, and that's going to delay trade and transportation. So by all accounts, Robert Fulton was very handsome, and his portrait was displayed in many of the finer homes in New York City. He had curly dark hair, blue eyes, definitely worthy of a historic crush. So I moved to Virginia from New York City knowing Fulton's name and his face, and thinking of him as an American inventor who helps usher in what we think of today as the first real stages of urban development and industrial progress. And what I didn't realize is that Fulton and Jefferson were contemporaries. So here I'd had Thomas Jefferson compartmentalized in my head, but in actuality, Jefferson and Fulton are living at the same time, and they're interested in so many of the same things. They correspond about inventions and engineering projects, things like the construction of the Erie Canal, and even a plan for protecting New York Harbor with torpedoes and submarines. I'm not making it up. In March of 1810, Jefferson writes to Fulton from Monticello and says, quote, "Where a new invention is supported by well-known principles and promises to be useful, it ought to be tried." So I come to learn that Fulton actually helps Jefferson with the one invention that we credit him for, and that's the moldboard plow of least resistance. In April of 1810, Jefferson borrowed a machine for measuring force from Robert Fulton in order to measure mathematically the force necessary to pull a plow fitted with his own, quote, mathematically perfect mold board. For me, realizing that these two men, Fulton and Jefferson, who I had labeled and categorized in very different historical compartments in my brain, were not only contemporaries, but friends and men who shared so many common pursuits and interests, it helped me realize the elasticity of history and the interconnectedness of it all. And I think this is an important part of Jefferson's legacy. There's a part of it that touches all of us: scientist, artist, politician, citizen, educator, farmer. Name a topic, and Jefferson's got his fingers in it.
Okay, cool. So when I went to see the grave of Alexander Hamilton a year and a half ago, so I think September of 2019, I took my family because my oldest really got into Hamilton, and we all were getting into Hamilton too. And so we wanted to visit sites in New York for Hamilton. So we went to his last house. We went to the place where he was shot with a duel, which is really just a shopping mall now, and very little actually on the spot. But we also went to his gravesite, and we're walking around and we're seeing, Hamilton and Eliza's grave and all that, and they're fangirling, I guess, but they're not really freaking out because it's a cemetery. But over beyond, next to Hamilton, another notable was Robert Fulton, and I'm like, oh my God, oh my God, oh my God. And so my wife and my kids were like, who's that? And I'm like, who's that? That's Hamilton. That's Robert Fulton. Like, that's Robert Fulton. And what? And, you know, he's the guy that brought steam engines to the United States, like completely revolutionized the Industrial Revolution for the United States. And like, oh, okay, great. So anyway, I did find a way to get them into this little bit. And I was like, here's a really cool, fun story. Robert Hamilton, Hamilton's son, was killed in a duel at the same dueling ground 2 years prior to Hamilton by a guy by the name of George Eaker. Now, the fun story about that is that Robert Hamilton was the second person to duel Eaker for the comments he said about Alexander. The first duel didn't do anything. Both of them just sat there with their guns pointed up, not shooting each other because they didn't want to shoot. They have Robert's turn the next day, and none of them point at one another, and they hold it up again, and George Eaker's like, enough of this is stupid, fires and points and shoots and eventually kills Robert. Now, Eaker doesn't go on to anything amazing. In fact, he died 2 years later, I believe of tuberculosis, but he died of some illness. But he was engaged. He was engaged to... His fiancée was Harriet Livingston, and her grandfather was actually last name was Schuyler, very similar in family to Elizabeth Schuyler. So there's one little connection. But the second one is when George Eaker died, his fiancée they never married, she actually married Robert Fulton. Now, I learned a little bit more in a second. He was 42 and she was 18, I believe, and they had a couple kids together. So that was an interesting match for 1807, I believe, is when they got married. But anyway, there's your little connection to fanboying and fangirling and all over that stuff. So that was one. Now, another interesting case that came up between Westinghouse, who was creating his own electric company, and General Electric, which was the company that was originally founded by Thomas Edison but taken over by J.P. Morgan, the famous banker and nice person, robber baron or whatever you want to call him. He was a very scrupulous businessman. So both Westinghouse and GE were trying to create a Niagara power plant to have the Niagara River produce hydroelectric power. When Westinghouse had his designs using Tesla's design, had his design for the power plant, he was using Tesla's ideas to generate the electricity. And realizing he couldn't afford that, the patent, Tesla was like, no, I need to beat Edison. Go ahead and use my patent for free. I'll release it. So he puts it out there. Well, Westinghouse actually gets the contract and is working towards building the Niagara power plant. So what happens is Westinghouse builds the Niagara power plant and kind of wins the war to get electricity into New York City. The problem is New York was deciding at the time to develop a new way of execution of criminals, to get away from hanging and try the electric chair. Well, Thomas Edison, still bitter about losing his plans, decides to build an electric chair made out of alternating current rather than his direct current that he was proposing. That's where you get the AC and DC. Alternating current is more efficient, yet he was trying to promote it as something bad. So he made the electric chair out of alternating current. And what happens from that is the world sees what electricity can do and freaks out. A lot of people start saying, whoa, if electricity can do this, I don't know if we want this in our homes. Is this safe? Meanwhile, the process to putting more and more light bulbs into into cities grows with the increase of electricity. Now, Westinghouse develops a light bulb they say is better than Thomas Edison's. Edison, once again, not wanting to lose, sues them and eventually takes them to court where Westinghouse cannot compete, to the point where they just eventually settle to buy the patent from Edison, even though it's not the same. And one more side note, where Marconi gets the win for the first successful wireless radio, It was using 17 of Tesla's patents. Tesla suffered a nervous breakdown just prior to Marconi's patent, and it wasn't until 1943, I believe, that the United States recognizes that Tesla was the first one to help and build the radio, even though Marconi won the Nobel Prize in Physics for his contributions to the wireless radio. And the Nobel prizes are never given to someone who has died. There's never posthumous ones. So there's some fun and interesting and awful facts about all of this, is that there's a lot of business drama going on behind the scenes. So the next question is, how does these governments respond to the Industrial Revolution, and what do they do? Well, first, I already mentioned about Japan and Russia particularly, but there's a lot more about it that we need to go over. The first one to mention, though, is Egypt had an industrialization through their textile industry, trying to mass produce Egyptian cotton, where we get the name Egyptian cotton. It's because of this industrialization that the cotton that the South tried to export in the 1860s during the Civil War wasn't as valuable as beforehand, because England found other routes to getting cotton, since they no longer approved of the slave trade and slavery in general. So they found other routes. So the story happens here is that Matthew Perry, a Commodore from the United States, comes to Kyoto Harbor in 1850s, 53. I usually say 35, and it's because numbers switch anyway. And what he basically says is, we want to trade with you. And Japan says, we're closed. We're a shogunate. We've had tight restrictions. If you want to trade, go talk to the Dutch down in Nagasaki, if they're still there. So the Japanese were pretty much closed as an island, and the United States wasn't having it. They said, nope, we're trading with you because we got gunboats. And they basically already opened fire on Kyoto and parts of Tokyo Bay when they made a peace treaty to open Japan up to trading. What this did, though, to the Japanese was signal to them they're behind by being so isolated. Look what these guys could produce and show up and do to us, and we could not stop them because of their cannon. And so from that, the Japanese realize that they need to modernize as well if they're ever going to compete on the world stage, because they were basically humiliated when they thought they were better than everyone. They are in fact the opposite. So they realize this, but there's a growing group in the Japanese that are dissatisfied with the shogun and the old ways, and seeing a need to modernize. And it causes a civil war. Probably one of the best Total War games I've ever played is Shogun 2 Total War, and then there's the Fall of the Samurai variant, which is this civil war. It ends in the late 1860s, early 1870s with the Meiji Restoration. Meiji is the Meiji Emperor, the guy pictured in that meme over here, the haha steam train go choo-choo. But they were all in favor of modernization. And in doing so, they brought in railroads, they brought in Western advisors on how to industrialize, and quickly set about industrializing their entire nation. But they realized one thing: they're lacking in resources, particularly industrial one. Oil, coal, even iron. They never had good sources of it in Japan. So they have to trade, and they go in trading, and they realize also, though, when they have the guns and no one else does, they can invade and take over. And so they conquer Korea, they get Taiwan in 1910. They go on basically a Pacific version of an empire, of the European empires, to have their own empire. And that expansion is going to go all the way to 1945, or 43 if you want to get technical about World War II. So next up is economic developments. So some of the first things was a hands-off policy towards business in general, that at the time the government should not be involved in the day-to-day operations of life with the people inside, mainly because the workers choose their labor. And while Adam Smith is propped up as basically saying government should be hands-off when it comes to labor, it's not quite that simple with Adam Smith. His whole ideas in morality were that workers were paid living wages, wages that they could survive off of, and that everyone was working within the best interest of the system, not in the best interest of a personal individual. And what I mean by that, because it sounds very different than his invisible hand and things work out itself, he does say, everyone's working in their self-interest in the entire system, and that's what makes our economy work the way it does. That, a pin maker has an vested interest to make more pins. So what does he do? He finds the best metals to make pins. He finds the best workers and puts them in the right jobs. All of this is part of his own interest to make the best pins to sell them for profit. Cool. What he doesn't say, though, is that all of this should be done at the expense of the people working there. There isn't this sense of, well, if workers should be paid as cheap as they'll be willing to work. That's how you base labor. He had different views on that. And so his opinions and his viewpoints are not as simple and simplified as we think. So though he does regard that trade should be free and independent and free of government intervention, because as we put tariffs on things, taxes on imports, for example, we hurt the other country we're dealing with, who will then raise tariffs on us, which was very similar to what was happening recently with foreign trade, particularly with China, in 2016, 17, 18, around then. So a lot of these memes that I put up here, though, these are to show you the abuses of this hands-off policy towards these living conditions. Because, hey, if you can replace, it's not really the government's job to get involved about what's safe for the workers. They choose their job. They choose this out of their desire to make a wage. But the question really comes down to, and what the criticisms will be, do they actually choose this, or do they not have money or the ability to choose something else? And so that gets into some of these. A free market is one that people can exchange goods and services freely without interruption. There are stock markets, which those of us who follow Reddit know full well, to date this video, with the GameStop price increase and all that stuff. But that's what a stock market is you buy shares of the company and expect a return on the company's profits. And then there's limited liability corporations, where the corporations work together, but what they are responsible for, they're not liable individually. The corporation might go bankrupt, but I don't lose my money if I'm part of that corporation. And so the LLC becomes its own entity that has that back and forth. So yeah, that's some of the economic developments that come from all of this. Another fun fact was the development of telegraph. That's how Western Union worked. I could give like $50 to Western Union, and they would telegraph it over, and then Western Union would say, okay, well, they wouldn't telegraph the money, they would just telegraph, and then the Western Union would say, oh, cool, we just got the code that says you got $50, here's your $50. I think I already told you that in one of the videos, I forget. Oh well, we're moving on. So reactions to this industrial economy. So look at these living conditions, and you're going to see a quick video, by the way, of some of the some of the living conditions of the people there at the time. And so here's that video now.
In 2014, archaeologists found the remains of 13 children in a 19th century graveyard in Leeds. Now a museum, Armley Mill in Leeds was once the largest woolen mill in the world.
It would have been common for children as young as 6 to be working in spaces like this.
Wow, 6 years old,
Yeah.
That's unbelievable.
Children would be doing all sorts of different jobs. One of the most common jobs is the scavenger role. You'd be crawling under here, moving around and making sure that you're getting in, sweeping up the cotton and all those stray fibres, and getting out before the spinning machine comes back to its resting point. You have to make sure you're timing it right, making sure you've got exactly enough time to get in and get out. If you leave too little, well, it can cause some really serious accidents. Children were caught between the rollers, and these rails, and in some examples, their heads were crushed. Working alongside this heavy machinery for such long hours, 12 to 14 hours, means that children naturally, these very young children, are going to have lapses in concentration, and that's when these accidents happen. And then in the preparation rooms, you've got a lot of that dirt and dust coming out and really getting into the child's lungs. Cotton lung, built up over years of working in factories like this, was incredibly common. It would irritate the lungs as it was breathed in, and you had all sorts of irritations because of this work.
I am wondering whether our children from Victoria Gate were working in a place like this, because we're looking at the evidence on their bones. They've got bowed arms. You know, this kind of points to what they were doing day in, day out.
Bowed legs and bowed arms were fairly common in child labour cases. And also there could be fractures and things from discipline, so from beatings or from disobedience.
That does actually fit one of the children that we have. He's got fractured rib, and this looks like his jaw's been broken as well.
Physical punishments were common in factories and workshops. You've also got pressure from the bosses in the rooms themselves. So they might be giving children a whack with a strap or with a wooden club or whatever kind of implement that they could find to make sure that they're keeping to their task and they're maintaining their standard of work.
There's an article, like I was doing a little bit of reading, there's a report that a guy called Michael Sadler made to the House of Commons in 1832. It's actually what led to the 1833 Factory Act, which was supposed to reform things for children in factories. And he interviewed a person called Elizabeth Bentley, and her answers, they make me mad. He asked her, he said, what were your hours of labour? And she said, as a child, I worked from 5 in the morning till 9 at night. And then he said, what time was allowed for meals? We were allowed 40 minutes at noon. He said, had you any time to get breakfast or drinking? No, we got it as we could. Did you have time to eat it? No. We were obliged to leave it or to take it home, and when we did not take it, the overlooker took it and gave it to the pigs. Oh. And then he asked her, did it affect your health? And she said, yes. And basically, the end point was, it so badly affected her that by the time she was in her teens, she was unable to work anymore, and now she's in the poorhouse. Those conditions in those mills, they were awful, and they're going to leave a mark. They're going to leave marks on the body. They're going to leave marks on the bones.
But you got to understand, kids were working, and I know right now we're like, are you serious? But like, look at that child with dressed up as a coal miner because they could reach different pockets. Girls that were wearing dresses around heavy spinning machinery. That's a lot of loose clothing to be around something that could crush them. Not to mention long hair that could be spun within that and mess them up. Keep in mind the amount of hours they're working, the grueling pace, 6 days a week. A lot of these living and working conditions, not to mention what this does to you, whether it be the loss of childhood and a miserable existence, or just the fact that you're getting sick. I mean, imagine having coal in your lungs at age 6. What's that going to do to you at age 12 or 18? Life expectancy and all of this. Not to mention, those kids are all cheaper than paying adult men. And so a lot of these adult men don't always have the jobs because the kids could work for cheaper. So what new ideologies come from this? Well, first, Karl Marx is seeing this. He's writing in England. And he's seeing that these abuses towards the working class are creating a new separation of working class as well as the business class. Marx looks at the world from his own perspective, and it really creates a whole new way of thinking about the world around us and the industrialization, and goes back through history to show that there's always been a class struggle between the working class, the proletariat, and the bourgeoisie of the rich, the nobility, the elite, whatever. Those that had the power and the wealth, and those that had to work just to make a living. And he saw that the proletariat, all they have to do is unite against these groups and they will achieve their own form of what's called a communism. Keep in mind, what Marx was projecting and wishing for was not the communism of the 20th century. So when we talk about communism, in this case, we're talking about its ideological basis, its ideology, its belief system. And on paper, it is a wonderfully good sounding thing. It doesn't work with human nature. And the only times it's survived, and I don't even mean work, but survived, are in small countries, whether it be, I'm not saying North Korea in any way is good, the restriction of freedoms and liberties and all these restrictions, that's a communism, but it's also a dictatorship. Whereas the original ideas for communism were never dictatorial or totalitarian. Those are developments by Stalin, who Lenin even said, I don't want Stalin in charge. That guy's crazy. So that shows you how things turned out there. But anyway, capitalism then is that goods belong to the individual, and that whatever you produce and whatever you make is given to you. There are nothing granted to you or given to you as a given. You work for what you get. Socialism introduces a use of government to protect the interests of the people, where they involve themselves in production, business, and some collectivization. So when the United States built a dam in the Tennessee Valley Authority in the 1930s, that was socialism. When they have corporations that work just like other corporations, whether it's the Federal Deposit Insurance Corporation, that's socialism in our banking. Whether it's Amtrak, also federally owned, or the post office, those are all government corporations, and those are forms of socialism. Those are needs that we say we can't mess with the post office, that should be a government or a public function. Therefore, that should be a government-run thing. That's why the ideological underpinning between national health care has become such a huge debate. It is socialism, but at the same point, we already have socialism. No one in most countries that are democracies nowadays are not free of government intervention to business today. Now, the full tilt, though, is then going into a communism, where the government controls all private property and doles it out as it sees fit. The idea, once it's in, ideology, not how it turned out, is supposed to be about people working together in a collective for collective benefit. But that's not how human nature works. And if I told you all would get A's for the rest of the year, how many of you would still work or write essays or do whatever I ask if you're guaranteed an A? And that was one of the major failings of communism, is that everyone was guaranteed a wage, even if you didn't show up for work, because that way you could live. And we'll talk more about what the Soviet experiment with communism is. And just so you go home and be like, Mr. Johnson's saying this, I'm not saying any of these are right over another. These are just the forms that show up and the theories behind them. So there are elements to each one of them that have some very good benefits, and there's elements to each one of them that aren't. So that's really the struggle, I would say, of the 21st century now, is what is the government's role in our lives, and how do we figure that out? Anyway, one very Marxist thing South Park did, and I'm showing it to you because it's an amazing representation of Marxist theory in modern times that isn't communism, but showing the plight. And what happens with Marx's criticism is, by making people wage earners and capital as laborers, people become commodities. Their labor becomes something that can be commoditized and traded and devalued and not humanized. And so this South Park clip is about the Amazon workers trying to form a union and strike. Their leader is a guy that got in an Amazon accident and was boxed. Like, he got mushed into a box, but he's still alive in a box. So he's their leader, who's saying, like, Amazon's not doing anything about us. They're trying to find replacements to the Amazon workers. And you have a separation of those that are working for Amazon, who are trying to make a living, and the people that expect Amazon to fulfill their services. And you start seeing a separation of people being disconnected from the human element from one another. And I know it seems like a silly thing, but that's what South Park does. And there's little clips to the episode. But anyway, it's episode 22, number 9. I had to look it up to find it. So I'm going to show you just that like last 1 minute thing about Marxism applied today that is not necessarily overthrow the government or bring about a communism, but a recognition that this is a big deal. So here you go.
The history of this world is the history of class struggles. Alienated from the products of their labor, from their fellow laborers, and from their very essence, the oppressed worker will eventually strike back at those capitalists who control the means of production. We have nothing to lose but our chains. We will unite in revolution.
And if others try to break through the picket line?
Nothing else can be allowed into the fulfillment center, no matter what the cost.
We're ready to follow you, Josh.
Then follow me to hell.
Now, one other video I want to show you about the reactions to the industrial economy, particularly with showing you that there were prison reforms and school reforms, workplace conditions, new laws promoted. England was first in like the 1830s to create laws to protect workers, though they don't really come around. And they really don't come around until the late 1800s, 1880s and beyond, when new unions are starting to form, particularly also in the United States as well as Europe. And these collectivized unions that could represent labor as a whole meant that they could also strike as a whole. And there's a lot of conflict from these strikes, whether scabs were brought in, basically other workers to do the jobs for them, clashes with police and trying to keep order. So here's one of the songs that's now the Union Auto Workers song that was used in the 1940s, but it goes and predates this. The story behind this guy who sings this song, he would go around and he would ask for his normal monthly wage. Once he got paid his normally monthly wage for going around and singing, he did all his shows free to the people involved, to the populace, to like charity auctions and stuff like that. He entertained for free after he got his normal salary. So here's a little song and it's a video now. So.
Come all of you good workers, good news to you I'll tell, of how the good old Union has come in here to dwell.
Which side are you on? Which side are you on?
My daddy was a miner and I'm a miner's son, and I'll stick with the Union till every battle's won.
Which side are you on? Which side are you on?
They say in Harlan County there are no neutrals there. You'll either be a Union man or a thug for J.H. Blair.
Which side are you on? Which side are you on?
Oh, workers, can you stand it? Oh, tell me how you can. Will you be a lousy scab or will you be a man?
Which side are you on? Which side are you on?
Don't scab for the bosses, don't listen to their lies. Us poor folks haven't got a chance unless we organize.
Which side are you on? Which side are you on? Which side are you on? Which side are you on?
And also, because of these unions, we have a 5-day work week, limited hours down to 10 hours a day, better wages and better working conditions as well, and safety measures. So the next way of reaction to this are coming from non-European powers. In the Ottoman Empire, they realized that they needed to reform, that they were really not able to keep up with Europe, and so they had to find new ways of reforming, what's called the Tanzimat reforms. And they were giving more autonomy, they were more equalizing the population, so those that were not Muslim would still be granted their their equality under the law and better protections. And a group of young Ottomans, as they were called, didn't feel that these reforms went far enough. But there was also a hardline element within the Ottoman Empire that refused to go further. And because of that, it really stagnated the empire. It stopped the process of tax farming, which is where you have someone take the contract to get money from the people, and you got rid of that middleman. And a lot of that has to do with the complexity of governments that are increasing at this time. With quicker transportation, such as the railroad and telegraph, you're able to communicate and control a large area over longer distances in shorter time. On the other hand, the Qing Empire was quite powerful prior to the, I would say, the 1820s or so, but it was in steady decline due to rebellions and ineffective control, and to the point where they ended up in a war that both sides really didn't want in the Opium Wars, but that turned into a catastrophic defeat for the Qing, and really brought about what the Chinese actually called a century of humiliation. What was going on is that, particularly in the region of Canton, now you see where Hong Kong is, that the foreigners could trade in this depot for half a year. And the English generally wanted tea, silk, porcelain so they could bring home, but the Chinese weren't necessarily trading for anything other than silver, thinking they were the best. So in response to that, the British, without the sanction of the East India Company, would bring in opium and sell that illegally into the Chinese markets. And it was quite successful. Opium addiction soared throughout China. There was a huge demand for it. Most people didn't even fight it. Like, they didn't confiscate it or anything like that. Until about 1838, when a new administrator was sent down to Canton to get rid of the opium trade, and he confiscated all the opium. And in response to this confiscation, the British demanded that the Chinese pay for it, even though the guy that the British leader at the time that was in Canton said that the British would pay for the losses to the people that were illegally selling opium in the first place. But then Parliament couldn't afford it, and they realized, wait a minute, we can make the Chinese do this instead. And the Chinese refuse, and they eventually send an expedition to bombard and harass China at an act of war. And that's exactly what happens. And China ends up losing this horribly, underprepared, unable to fight. The English won almost every single battle with the exception of maybe one or two skirmishes. And what happens is that the Chinese allow more open ports to British trade. The British acquire Hong Kong and a lot more open rights to everybody in free trade. And because of that, there's going to be a large push from foreigners into China in all different places and really wreck the Chinese economy, not to mention how bad opium really is. Because it's bad. It's the basis for heroin. So I also just finished a huge book on that if you want to learn any more about it, because I know all about that fun stuff. So yeah, I know, super interesting. So anyway, the self-strengthening movement in the Chinese Empire was towards the late 1800s, where they tried to modernize and bring in more Western technology and ideas to help modernize China. However, there were a large group of hardliners who disagreed with these reforms, and it started what's called the Boxer Rebellion. And that rebellion is put down by 9 different foreign countries: Russia, Japan, France, Germany, England, United States. I think India was helpful, as well as Australia. So it's like there's 9 nations in one. So yeah, that's Qing China at the time. And then finally, the changes in society. So here you see a growing middle class, and I want you to look at that photo. So this is a photo maybe of I want to say 1860s to 80s or so, and how it's taken in the shot. They might look different from you, but they might be no different from your own family, or cousins' family, since they might be older than you, or some other family. But that was the norm of family unit. I mean, 4 kids was pretty common. The culture was used to having kids die before they got to 20, either before 1 year, 10 years, or 20 years. And so you had multiple children, but they weren't dying anymore due to all the technology. New medicines, new way of taking care of people, better living conditions. And so you had a growth of population all about. And so here you see a family, just like yours, just like mine, through time. That's what I love about history, for real. I know y'all like, whatever, just finish the video. Anyway, the other group, though, is the industrial working class. Those that are actually working in the factories at the very bottom. And here's one criticism of the whole system is over there, of the who's doing what and how they view this. Now, the one people that hurt in rights from all of this is middle class women, because they no longer are needed in factories and their husbands make enough money. They revert back to basically being in the domestic side of taking care of kids in the home, and not as many rights and not as many other opportunities for them, because they don't need to be secretaries or factory workers, or even in some cases some become teachers. Cool. Why? Right? But that also still remains new challenges. Look at that pollution, by the way. Like that's what they were doing with coal. I mean, we know what we know now. We're worried about pollution. That's coal. Poverty became a huge problem with large cities. You had now new problems with crime, with streets, with public health. One of the founders of like a study of geography was a guy by the name of John Snow, and everyone's like, oh my gosh, John Snow. But he looked at I believe it was a cholera outbreak in London, and traced them to where all the houses were affected, and traced it to 2 or 3 wells that were infected. And using geography for the first time as a discipline. There's also housing shortages of where people live. So people, in some cases, were living multiple families per room or per tenement floor, and inadequate infrastructure to support everyone. So the cities of this time, they haven't responded yet to the massive scale of population. They haven't built up yet. They're still building. The tallest brick building, I believe, is no more than 9 stories, because bricks cannot hold that kind of weight load. We need a new invention that can help us propel ourselves further into the sky. And that comes with the development of a better steel and the Bessemer steel process in the late 1800s, where we get to eventually use that towards the 1900s. So that's the Industrial Revolution in a nutshell. I'm sorry this video was so long. There's a lot to it, but good luck. And there's a silly video at the end of this. Watch it if you like. Have a good one.
In good old Queen Victoria's day, Industrial Revolution meant bosses said, please, we need more employees, we needed a solution. Who will climb our chimneys? Who will power our grids? Victorian families so desperately poor, they'll let us employ their kids for
work, terrible work,
from very young ages.
Up chimneys to clean,
Paid pitiful wages.
work, terrible work.
Pins make you work faster.
If we grow too big, get sacked by the master.
Now you're all in my employ, cleaning in the factory.
We're not very strong and the hours are long.
This work is unsatisfactory.
Learn not to get caught in spokes or trap our hands in gauges.
To stop machines and get you out will cost you a week's wages.
Work, terrible work.
There's no health or safety.
So if we get hurt, they will just replace me. Work, terrible work. Sorry. Now that I am short of cash, I have to pickpocket wallets from gentlemen and ladies' lockets. Small enough to get away, hardly ever caught. And if we are, we're kids, you see. To cry is what we're taught.